try to build on some common themes that emerge from looking at very diverse flows. So these are the kind of flows I will talk about. One is the gas, and the typical interaction length scales are of the order of about a micron. Another fluid system I'll talk about will be molecular monolayers, and these are nanoscopic single molecule monolayers, and look at how they behave under compression. And I'll also talk about just bubbles floating on water. There's a system called bubble rafts, and when you start imposing forces and stresses on these systems, they behave quite differently. But still, there are some common themes that encompass the kind of response that one sees, and there's hope that perhaps there's something unifying in looking at all of this. So, in a lot of these systems, we started seeing glimpses of the common themes emerging about a decade ago, and they continue to occur in various other experiments. Although I don't know of any theory that captures what we see in a non-equilibrium system for all the processes, for the kind of processes I look at. So I'll go through and try to illustrate the kind of things we're talking about. So here's a general slide about what the experiments kind of look like. You typically have something very confined. So everything we look at, the primary dynamics is in 2 dimensions. So you have some system which is very confined to 2 dimensions, and you're looking at it from the top. Okay, so in all the images, in all the movies I show you, you'll be having a top view of something evolving in a 2-dimensional space. So the first example is of a gas flow, and this is compressed carbon dioxide gas, and all you're doing is you're heating it from the bottom, and you're cooling it from the top, and the temperature difference is very small. You usually just have conduction. There's no mass flow. You just have a linear temperature gradient between the upper and lower plate. If you exceed some critical temperature difference, you start seeing the formation of some rolls. Okay, so the fluid actually starts moving. And if you look at, there are experimental ways to try and visualize these rolls. In this case, the confinement is of the order of about 500 microns. So you're looking at something the width of your fingernail filled with gas, and you're putting a temperature difference of a few degrees on it, and looking at what sort of patterns emerge. So if you look at it from the top, here's an experimental image of what these rolls like look from the top. The bright and dark regions correspond to hot and cold regions. So hot regions rise and cold regions come down. And so you essentially find rolls of convection where you have straight lines of hot followed by cold, followed by hot, followed by cold. And it's quite a symmetric pattern. And people knew about this for a long time. This has been known since the early 1900s. And in the 1960s, people figured out how stable this pattern of just straight rolls is when you impose a certain temperature difference versus, say, what the wavelength of these rolls would be. And about a decade or so ago, people were quite surprised to find a state like this, which is a very time-dependent state, which has no symmetries that we know of, but you find a lot of defects forming in the system. So locally, you find kind of straight roll states, but then find defects nucleating within these states. And the big question is, how does the state come about, and why is it there? And it seemed to be, it's at the same parameter regime as a normal straight roll state. So it's bistable with that. And how do we look at these systems? One way of looking at it is to look at what the coarse-grained dynamics is like. So you have these local defects that are within the system that keep popping up. So you have the pattern punctuated with defects. And these defects lead to a strange topology, a strange geometry. And you can characterize the geometry, for example, by just ignoring any of the microscopic dynamics, just looking at saying, okay, how big is a roll? Where is it located? And how do these rolls pack with each other? What are the length scales of the distributions? How many intersections do you have, which is a sort of measure of how many defects were created? What is the time scale of these defects? And issues like that. Okay, and you can look at this evolution in time, and that's sort of what it looks like. So each of the dots represents the formation of a defect, and the colors represent just how it goes. So you can follow all the dynamics in a very topological sense over here. Okay. And here, for example, is one of the length scales that comes out of the system. What we're looking at as a function of temperature, the temperature increases, temperature differences increase as you go down, is that you start seeing some sort of a scaling behavior in how big a roll is, the convection roll is, versus how many rolls there are. Okay, so you have all these defects in cracking. It looks like a very complicated system, but eventually you come to some sort of a scale-free dynamics that goes on. Okay, so this is one illustration of what's going on. So we had the two sort of instabilities going on in the system. Initially, as you change temperature, you go from a state where you just have conduction to a state where you have convection and rolls. And then these rolls become time dependent. And the important thing to remember from this example is that you have local instabilities. So you have these small defects that keep popping up that break the symmetry of the original state you had. Okay, so that's something that will be common in everything, in all the systems I discuss. Okay, and there'll be other things that are common that I'll illustrate in the next system, which are also common over here. And the next system is looking at lung surfactants. So it turns out that you can, when you have, your lungs are coated with surfactants which help in breathing. And very often you can have premature babies who don't produce the surfactant, and they essentially suffocate to death until there was the development of a bovine extract to be given to babies, which you could give them till they started developing their own lung surfactants, and that helped reduce infant mortality very greatly, by almost 70% or so. And we're trying to understand how this works, how the surfactant works, see if we can make a purer form, a more synthetic form. But the mechanisms of how it works are still unknown. The primary things that go into this surfactant are things called phospholipids. The important thing to remember about phospholipids is they have a head group and a tail group, and the head group likes water, the tail group doesn't. And so you can, for example, float these phospholipids on water. So I'm looking at water, and the head groups stick into the water and the tail groups stick out. And they form a beautiful monolayer. You can add dyes to, fluorescent dyes to these monolayers, and you can change the packing ratios of these molecules by just changing the area over which they're spread. So you can have diameers that compress and elongate and change the relative area of the molecule of these monolayers. And you can look at it with a microscope. And typically what happens when you compress these monolayers a lot is that they start failing. And there's a few different ways in which the failure from a two-dimensional interface happens. One, you can have the interface just crack, or you could have, for example, over here an image where you have just vesiculation, so the molecules from the surface just diffuse into the bulk, and this might be by forming micelles or just individual molecules and gaining another equilibrium between the surface and the bulk. Or you could have something interesting, which is folding, and this is what I'll talk about. And folding is a mechanism where you have your molecules on this interface, but then they buckle into the surface, and if you expand out, they buckle back out. And it's very interesting that these molecules do this because it's a process that's reversible. And we know when we breathe, our lungs are expanding and contracting, and it's important to have a surfactant that can respread without getting lost into the bulk of any other material within the lung. And here's a movie of So here's a movie of what the folding events look like. And this is essentially looking at the molecules. The scale here is about 10 microns for each domain. So when you compress these molecules too much, they start condensing into domains. And these domains are regions which expel the dye molecules because they're a slightly odd shape and they don't crystallize in. But this is a region where you don't see folding, but you also notice that you have folding, and this is what it looks like. And so these are just folds occurring on a molecularly thin monolayer. And you can have cascades of these folds. So this is like having a defect, but then one defect nucleates another one, and then another gets nucleated. So you can think of power law scalings in these sort of systems as well. And one of the origins that are considered to occur over here are, if you look at the interface between domains, you have regions which are very crystalline. So this is an AFM image of one of these domains. And the lighter colors indicate a higher elevation because all the molecules are packed closer and the tails of the molecules point up. And in regions where you have a more fluidic region outside the domains, the tails get oriented any which way. And so you typically don't have a uniform structure as you see in the bubble. And you can have gradients in viscosity and elasticity between these regions which might nucleate these folds. And this is sort of what was proposed in a mechanism for having cascades of instabilities that lead to folds. Okay, so previously we had these defects, now we have these folds. And the nice thing is that both the defects and the folds are coexistent. You can have a region that is flat and a region that is folded being coexistent on the same monolith. Okay. There are ways to affect how the microscopic interaction between domains occurs. For example, you could, instead of just compressing it one way, you could compress it with a different symmetry. So instead of having a rectangular symmetry of compression, so this is the macroscopic compression you impose, you could have a circular symmetry. And for example, that's a picture of the experiment where we compress a monolayer circularly. And you can have these folds which still occur, but you don't notice the same sort of symmetries, and they're very, very infrequent. So you somehow reduce the number of folds that occur within the system. Okay. The last thing I'll quickly go over is shared bubble wraps. And in shared bubble wraps, you essentially are looking at bubbles floating on the surface of water. And we're going to impose a shear, so you float them on the surface of water and have bands that essentially shear this entire bubble wrap. And if you look at it from the top, it looks somewhat like this. So you're pulling bubbles one way on one surface and pulling them the other way on the other surface. And you notice that there's some sort of rearrangements going on, and I'll discuss that a little more in detail. And this is what the microscopic rearrangements look like. So you have regions where nearest neighbors become next nearest neighbors, and next nearest neighbors become nearest neighbors. So these are called T1 events, and this is another example of where you have stresses getting focused within the system. So if you look at the defects in spiral defect gas and the gas flows, you have these defects nucleating where stresses are focused. In the monolayers, you have these folding events when the stress got too high, the system collapsed and left the 2D interface. Here you have T1 events that are normally uniformly distributed across the entire system. And you can look at trajectories of bubbles. So you have these fluctuations in the positions of bubbles, and you can have some very different response to these fluctuations. So for example, over here, you're going to notice a bubble which I'm just tracking, which essentially it gets displaced linearly with time. Over here, you have a bubble that's sort of just diffusing away at the same spot. And there's a bubble that does something more intermediate. It's somewhere between being ballistic transport and diffusive transport. And you can have variations in the velocity field. And you sort of notice regions of focusing in the velocity field, which sort of tell you how the stresses are getting built up within the system. So this is essentially showing you the velocity of each individual bubble as you observe them. And every time you repeat an experiment, you get some sort of a deviation from a mean profile. And this deviation from a mean profile is sometimes referred to as shear banding. And shear banding occurs because you have T1 events that are more prominent in one region versus less prominent in another region. And here's an example. So for example, if you look at the deviation from the mean profile, you can see very extensive shear bands throughout the system. And if you average over a number of experiments, you get something that matches just the mean velocity profile that one would expect from purely elastic deformation. Okay, so you have regions where the bubbles kind of stretch, where there's no rearrangement, no topological change, where neighbors become next neighbors, and regions where you have, here I just showed for oscillatory shear, and regions where you have a lot of topological rearrangements. So again, this is the coexistence between something that's elastic and something that's plastic. And with that, I'll just come to some of the common themes that were in all these experiments. So one is you have confinement, which sort of focuses stresses. And this focusing occurs at a very local scale. And this leads to some instability in the fluid flow. And the way this instability occurs, you break symmetries of whatever was prevalent before. But whatever was prevalent before coexists with the broken symmetry state. So this is common in all three cases. And typically you can extract some sort of a power law behavior in these systems. So we saw it in the roll lens, we saw it, there was a power law in how you can have a cascade of folding events in a molecular monolayer. And in the bubble rash, you can think of how is the viscosity contributing, developing as you shear